Hello, and welcome to episode 14 of the PI Filmmaker podcast. Now, I'm back on my own this week. There's no guest, unfortunately, if you've been enjoying those episodes. It's just me again. But I think it's the right time, given that the last, I don't know, however many, 5 have been me and a guest. But this week I'm going to be discussing Guillermo del Toro, because the past weekend, the 9th and 10th of May, I went down to London because the BFI had a series of screenings and introductions by Del Toro himself for some of his films. It was really great hearing Del Toro speak about his work. I'm just going to talk about that this week, and also bring in some of my own personal experiences and use Del Toro to contrast some of those experiences. Hopefully it's going to be of interest. So as I say, I went down to London, and initially I had tickets for a Q&A for Crimson Peak and an introduction for The Shape of Water. Pan's Labyrinth was sold out. I was devastated, but fortunately some people must have been getting refunds, and I managed to get tickets for Pan's Labyrinth as well. And then whilst down there, my partner and I also went to see him talk about an animated series that he'd done. It was called Tales of Arcadia. Apparently it's 3 series that are a bit like the Avengers, in that they all the characters come in and out of each other's stories. I've not seen it. I've watched a couple of episodes now, but because it was on sale, I thought, well, I'll go and check that out as well, because whilst we were down there, Del Toro said during the Shape of Water introduction that he was as proud of Tales of Arcadia as he was some of the films that he's made, so that sold us. But in terms of my introduction to Del Toro, or becoming aware of Del Toro as a filmmaker, it was really during the time around 2002 when I bought the Blade 2 DVD. Obviously, I loved the first Blade, and for the second film, they had a new filmmaker on board to direct it. And I remember buying the DVD, and back then I always devoured the special features, the commentaries, and I obviously heard this filmmaker, Guillermo del Toro, talking passionately about filmmaking, and I was just enamored with how passionate he was, how he thought about every element of production. It was clear that nothing ended up in his film by accident, and if it did, it was something he kind of owned up to and admitted, okay, this doesn't quite work. I remember him discussing some of the CGI fight scenes where they used digital doubles for one of the fights, and he said, yeah, it's not quite there yet. And that was refreshing to hear someone talking about how these things ended up in the screen, on screen, and why he loved them and why he likes to present things like this, but also what didn't work. So I was really kind of impressed by how he spoke about filmmaking, and I thought, okay, I need to go and check out more of this guy's work. And since then, I've just been a huge fan, even when some of the films don't work for me personally. For those who are unfamiliar with Guillermo del Toro, his films are as follows. So in 1993, he did his debut feature, which was Kronos, and that was $2 million. In 1997, he did Mimic, which he frequently cites as being one of the worst experiences of his life, because it was obviously with the Weinsteins, and he tells this story about how there's been 2 really horrific experiences in his life in the 90s. One was the kidnapping of his father, and the second was making Mimic with the Weinsteins. And he said in many ways Mimic was worse because he understood what the kidnappers were after, whereas the notes and ideas that he was getting from the Weinsteins, he didn't understand what they wanted. And obviously it's just a humorous anecdote now, which he refers to over and over again. If you find any clips online, you'll see him talking about it. And Mimic was done for $25 to $30 million. Then in 2001, he did a film called The Devil's Backbone, which is really good film. I've just recently picked up the 4K Studio Canal release of that. I'm yet to watch it. And that was 54 million. 54 million? No, I'm skipping ahead. 54 million. I've got notes on the screen, bear with me. So The Devil's Backbone was 4.5 million, okay? So he'd kind of dropped down to a lower budget again after Mimic, and he'd gone back to a Spanish language film, whereas Mimic was done in the US. Then in 2002, he did Blade 2, as noted previously, and that was 54 million, so quite the leap from 4.5 million to 54 million. Then in 2004, he did Hellboy, and that was 66 million. And again, I remember getting the DVD for that and just hearing him, how passionate he was about the story, but also really developing this idea, or getting a grasp of this idea that for him, monsters were very personal, very autobiographical. If memory serves, at the end on the audio commentary at the end of that film, Del Toro says he actually gave a line to Hellboy that was something that he said to his first wife at the time, which is, "All I can say is I'm always going to look this good." And it was his way of just being humorous with his wife on an early date. But he gave that line of he gave that as a line of dialogue to Hellboy, and I thought that was just really interesting how he was using personal details from his own life for these films, which were essentially like fantasy, blockbuster fantasies. And then in 2006, he did Pan's Labyrinth, and that was 19.5 million. And for me, this is Del Toro's masterpiece. I've watched this film so many times. I find it so moving. I did have tickets for the screening, the Q&A down in London over the weekend, and I found myself just in tears once again. I find it such a moving film. And again, on the DVD, Del Toro talks about the personal nature of this film. He says that Devil's Backbone and Pan's Labyrinth are kind of siblings. And if you notice, Devil's Backbone came out in 2001, and one of the things he spoke about at one of the Q&As over the weekend, and he's spoken about this previously, it's in books that you'll find on Del Toro. He said Devil's Backbone came out prior to September 11th, and 5 years later you have Pan's Labyrinth, and he said everything he had to say about the violent world in which we live in, it changed after 9/11, and Pan's Labyrinth is a reflection of that in some ways. Hellboy 2 in 2008, which was 85 million, and then he did Pacific Rim in 2013, which was 190 million. So we're getting into real big numbers now. I mean, they're all big numbers to a micro budget indie filmmaker, but 190 million for Pacific Rim, which he says is one of his he's a real big fan of. It's one of his favorite films that he's made. For me, I'll be honest, it doesn't quite work for me in some of the ways that his other films resonate with me emotionally, but hey, each to their own. In 2015, he did Crimson Peak, which is one of the films we got tickets for the Q&A for, and that was at 55 million. And then in 2017, he did The Shape of Water, which has this kind of theme of the other, the immigrant, and I think it's no coincidence that it won all the Oscars the year after Trump was elected, and he was saying build the wall, because here we have a character who's being we have a creature that's being hunted down by government agents, and we have this person who shows compassion for this creature. Nightmare Alley in 2021, which I'm a big fan of, and again I got the 4K this past Christmas, which has a black and white version of the film. Interestingly, Del Toro at the Q&A over the weekend said he asked the studio how much money he'd get if Shape of Water was in black and white, and they said something like 16. He said, okay, how much in colour? And they said 19.5 million. So they were willing to give 3 million more for him to put it in colour. Just kind of interesting, because I was wondering if maybe there was similar conversations on Nightmare Alley, and then through a home release he can then present the film in a way that he's possibly more comfortable with, because the black and white edition of Nightmare Alley is his director's cut, so there's more footage put back in, and it is in black and white, and I think it was spectacular, that black and white edition. But again, I'm a fan of black and white films. I know some people won't watch black and white films. I think it's a shame. Pinocchio, Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio in 2022 at Netflix, and this was 35 million, and again this was one that had me in tears at the end. I was so moved by it. he just has that way of really making you resonate with these outsiders, these loners, and I think that's a theme that really resonates for me. The loner, isolation, and we see in a number of his films that his characters are isolated. Pan's Labyrinth, it's the little girl's isolation is so moving. She's looking around for a mother. Her mother's kind of distant and kind of subservient to the captain, her stepfather, and then the captain himself, this kind of stern, violent person working for the government. Again, we have that theme. And then in 2025, he worked with Netflix again for Frankenstein, which is obviously something he's been working toward his whole life, essentially. And you can see elements of it in so many of his films. And that was 120 million. So when we talk about these numbers, I've put the budgets in there because when you're dealing with micro-budget filmmaking, say I make a film, a last feature like Blurred Lines, around 10k versus 120 million. We're dealing with, like, my budget was 0.008% of Guillermo del Toro's last budget. And it kind of puts things into perspective a little bit, because one of the things I find frustrating about micro-budget filmmaking is you will always see people on Letterboxd. I had it recently, someone, I don't know who they were, they left a review of X and they said sometimes the budget rears its head. And it's like, yes, of course it does, because you're used to watching $120 million blockbusters, if not higher. It's like comparing a Punto to a Porsche. They don't operate in the same way. They don't look as slick. So I just find it really strange in film that we have this kind of, we're hung up on budgets in a way that other art forms were not, or even as noted in cars, you accept that a Punto can't do what a Porsche can do, but maybe it serves a different purpose and a different audience as well. Still, one of the things that I love about Del Toro's work is the personal nature of it. On the Friday night before Miranda and I went down, I watched the Kronos 4K in preparation. Well, we both did, because BFI have recently re-released it, remastered it in 4K, and that's his first feature. And on the special features on the disc, he talks about the fact that him and his brother, when he was like 2 years old, he has this vivid memory of watching, I think he said it was was it Twilight Zone or The Outer Limits, one of those shows, and then after, his brother kind of dressed up as a monster and just scared the shit out of him, basically. And he's talked frequently about, like, waking up from or having lucid dreams and seeing monsters at the end of his bed. So for him, monsters are something that are very autobiographical, very personal, and he always talks about the fact that the monster is imperfect, and he sees himself in that. So I've always found the way he talks about filmmaking so interesting, and how he approaches storytelling so interesting, because even with these huge budgets, we're dealing with someone who's very much about presenting a personal, singular voice. And for me, that is something that I've always found appealing. And one of the things that I neglected to mention is that when I was 24, I actually met Del Toro at a book signing. So Guillermo del Toro he'd written alongside, I think it was with another writer, he'd written this series of books called The Strain, and the first one was being released, and as part of the promotion, he was doing book signings at various locations, and he actually came to the Waterstones on Deansgate in Manchester, and I managed to get there. I don't know how far down was I? I was maybe number 30 in line or something, so I could see him, and he was signing for different people. And for every copy of a book that you bought, you could have a personal piece of memorabilia signed. So earlier that day, I bought a new copy of Pan's Labyrinth on DVD. I was in line with the book, ready for it to be signed, and I took my Pan's Labyrinth DVD. And as he was about to sign the book, I remember saying to him, "Can I just say thank you so much for your work?" Because this would have been, what year would it have been? So 2009. He'd just done Hellboy 2, and Pan's Labyrinth was out, which I just absolutely adored, and probably in my top 10 films of all time. Pan's Labyrinth, I think it's one of the best films of the last 25 years at least. Um, and I said, can I just say thank you so much for your work? He put the pen down and he put out his hand and he said thank you so much, and it struck me because I couldn't believe he must have heard this dozens and dozens and dozens of times, but he put out his hand and thanked me as if it was the first time he'd ever heard it. And they say never meet your heroes. You don't want to meet your heroes. He was the kind of the exception to that because he was so humble. He was so giving with his time. I remember one of the people who was getting the book signed brought a blank white canvas, and they asked him to draw Hellboy and sign it, and he did. He didn't say, no, that's going to take too long. He sat there and did it. I remember one guy, though, he brought a copy of the book of The Hobbit as his piece of memorabilia to be signed, because at the time Guillermo del Toro was working on the pre-production for the Hobbit movies. In the end, obviously, he didn't end up making them, and I think it's such a shame that he didn't get to make those films, because clearly he'd put a lot of time and effort into them, into developing the production design, the story. It is a real shame. But anyway, I always think, I wonder what that person thinks now. They've got a signed copy of the Hobbit book, which Guillermo del Toro never ended up directing. But there you go. But I do have my Pan's Labyrinth DVD to the side of me right now. It's always on the shelf close to me, and it does say Hola Mark, Guillermo del Toro, and obviously in the book it's signed as well, and there's a little sketch of his face that he does in each one too. So yeah, it was a really lovely experience meeting Del Toro back in 2009 when I was 24 years old, and I have continued to be inspired by his work, even when some of the films don't work 100% for me. Because what I think is interesting, even if there's details that don't work, he can articulate why they're there. And I've got a few of his books on the shelf for different films. I've got the Cabinet of Curiosities book, which is there's interviews with him, personal sketches from various films. I've got the Pan's Labyrinth one, Devil's Backbone, Shape of Water, and even when he's really great at explaining why he did certain things, why he made certain choices. And the Crimson Peak Q&A over the weekend was really interesting because he talked about the fact that the ghosts were red, and he said he's still not quite sure whether that was the right decision. And he actually said, beware of the great ideas because they usually end up being shitty ones. And he said, what's interesting is people tend to think they're digital because they're red, but no, they were done practically, and then a translucent effect was done in post. But he questions that, and I love hearing when filmmakers like, maybe this didn't quite work, and you move on and you think you do better next time. And that's what it's all about, like making a film, identifying what worked, being honest about what doesn't work, moving forward. And as long as you're moving forward and I think developing things personally, I think you're on the right track. So yeah, obviously he was a huge inspiration to me, and still is. So when I was teaching a module that I discussed previously, which I developed and created, which was personal and independent filmmaking, I was keen to put in some clips of Del Toro discussing the personal nature of his work, because I think sometimes when you say personal, you think, okay, autobiography. If I just make a film that's about my life verbatim, then I'm winning, I'm doing it. And I don't think that's the case. Like, Del Toro's someone who, on the surface, you're watching these films in which monsters are there, and we have these outside humans that are outsiders. You might look at it and think, well, okay, how's this personal? But he can articulate it very well. And I'm going to play a little clip. Well, not a little clip. I'm going to play the clip that I used for Del Toro in a moment, because I think it's worth setting up what I'm going to discuss in the rest of this episode. And some of it might be repeated, because I think what's interesting about Del Toro is you see that this is a filmmaker who keeps coming back to the same ideas over and over again. And he said that if you look at the first film and then the most recent film, hopefully you can see a filmmaker who, even when working inside Hollywood, has tried to present a singular vision or a singular perspective. And And when I did these lectures, I actually did them as video essays because I thought that that might be engaging for students. And for some, I think it was. But I remember some students saying, I don't like video lectures. I'd rather be there in person. And then they don't show up. So you kind of left wondering, well, what is it you want? And I think like that maybe speaks to the fact that if you can't get engaged with someone, listening to someone talk about filmmaking for an hour or so, maybe cinema's not for you. And I know that sounds really brutal, but I'm going to get onto brutal feedback in a little while. Because, as noted previously, when I was 16, 17, 18, I was devouring these DVDs. I was spending weekends just listening to audio commentaries, watching interviews with filmmakers, because that's how you learn. What have other people done, and what can I take from that? How can that help me improve my filmmaking? Maybe not in terms of the budget, because as noted, like, we're dealing with filmmakers here who are working on levels that I can only dream of being at. And one of the things that frustrates me frequently is when people say like, oh, the production design in your film is a bit studenty, Mark. It's like, yes, we're talking about £10,000 versus 120 million. Like, it'd be wonderful to be in the position Del Toro's in, where you can have these lavish sets, these lavish costumes, but you work within your means. And I'll discuss that a little bit later, because we'll also get onto budget, which is something he discussed over the weekend. But first off, have a quick listen to this section from one of my video essays or video lectures, and then we'll crack on. Guillermo del Toro has created equally unique and fascinating fantasy worlds that are dominated by men and monsters. He says, one of the things that I've always believed is that you should not make the movies you need, but the movies that need you, that wouldn't exist if you didn't make them. That's where your voice really resides. As a result, when interviewed for his Spanish film Devil's Backbone in 2001, he said the following: if you want to make a personal film, don't fuck around, make a personal film. Don't go and try and do it in a studio. Now, one might wonder the ways in which the fantasy and horror films of Del Toro are personal. However, for Del Toro, Ghosts and Monsters are as personal as a family drama.
I've heard 2 ghosts in my life, and the first time was in the bedroom of my late uncle at my parents' house. All of a sudden I heard this really deep sigh, and I thought, what the hell was that? And I turned off the TV, and I waited, and I heard it again. And at that moment I recognized the voice. I went, I know that voice. It's my uncle's voice. Oh my God, this is my uncle's room. Oh my God, this is a ghost. Oh my, and all that, like in 1 second. And I freaked out and ran away, and I never slept in that room again, but I never heard him again.
And in regards to Pan's Labyrinth, he says the following:
it's almost like the first summation of what I have learned as a filmmaker, all put to the service of one of the most personal, if not the most personal movie. It ranks really high in that way. Pan's Labyrinth defines exactly where I was in my life at that moment, wondering if there was magic in the world. Not in a whimsical sense, but if the world was either terrible or beautiful, or both at the same time, and the answer was both at the same time.
In his films, we often have the literal monster and then the real monster, which is often a human. Indeed, Del Toro says, every time I make a movie, I always say that the worst monster is a human. This notion of man as monster/monstrous is something he returns to again and again. Kronos, The Devil's Backbone, Crimson Peak, The Shape of Water, Nightmare Alley. So in terms of your own personal film, it might be the case that there's a particular theme that you want to explore due to your own connection to it.
There are themes that go throughout all of your filmography.
Yes. Yeah.
Which ones you recognize?
Well, I recognize 2. One of them is the virtue of disobedience, which I think is vital. Mm-hmm. To be disobedient is to be a thinking person, and I think the other one is the absolute inalienable right to be fucked up. Imperfection is one of the most beautiful things, fallibility, imperfection, and that's why I think those themes are very well represented in The Monster. We are all complex people. We are all paradoxical people. 9 a.m. you're a saint. 9:30 you're an asshole. 10:30 you're a great father. 11:45 you're a bad son. And that's you. You should be every color in the rainbow. You shouldn't be black or white. And I think The Monster is imperfection is beautiful.
Yes, this monster specifically in your film, They're very autobiographical.
Yes.
And sometimes literally in the sense of autobiography of stuff deeply rooted in your memories as a child.
Yes, I completely identify as that, and I felt when I was born, and I saw Frankenstein, I said that's my Jesus right there. You know, that's what I believe in. That's my saint. I'm a lapsed Catholic, but a Catholic, and a lot of the imagery and the resurrection, like Pinocchio is like the Jesus. Is like Christ, is made of wood, has nails, resurrects 3 times to save those that he loves. The resurrection, death, family, father figures. The older I get, the more I accept that things must be festering.
And when anyone approaches me and says, I want to be a director, I always tell them, then you should just be a director and don't say I'm going to be, because you can direct good or bad, but you can direct from your iPhone, from your cell phone, with your sister's cousin video camera, with a webcam, with right now, except in the most abject circumstances, most people can get a hold of an image audiovisual generating machine, and they can be directing and then realize that they are already directing. Directing doesn't mean anymore and shouldn't mean anymore directing feature films. And the advice I feel is that it's always better to answer through your work the things you don't like in a piece of media. If you dislike the movies that are being made, make your own. Show the world what you want to do, what you think this medium should be. And I find that much more creative than simply putting it down and complaining about it. Is a more active, fascinating role to take. So the advice is, if you want to direct, and even easier, if you want to write. And I think that's the thing to do, is like, show us, don't tell us, do the things. And if you do them wrong, but you do them in your own terms, that's how I define success, failing in your own terms.
So, the BFI weekend, on something like the Thursday night, I saw there was somehow tickets were available for Pan's Labyrinth again. And I asked my partner, and my partner was like, no, it's okay, you just go to that, because it was already costing quite a bit of money to go. So I booked one, and then my partner, once we were there, was like, oh, I should have took the Pan's Labyrinth ticket. And I was like, are you having a laugh? What? Why are you saying that now? I asked you. Somehow, on the Saturday night, after we'd watched the Shape of Water introduction, we were sat having some food in a Wetherspoons, because obviously you've spent enough money, you've driven down, you might as well go cheap on the food. I kept refreshing the screen for the Pan's Labyrinth tickets, and I got a second one on row B, which is where I ended up sitting, so that I could get some nice pictures of Del Toro. So both of us managed to go to the Pan's Labyrinth Q&A as well. So that was great, and obviously, as noted previously, we also bought tickets for the Sunday morning screening of this Q&A for this animated series that he'd done. And it was kind of a strange weekend in many ways, because the weekend coincided with the anniversary of my film Blurred Lines being released online, and obviously I've discussed previously the review bombing that took place after that. And it was kind of interesting for the fact that when you hear Del Toro speak, you remember what you know about filmmaking, what you've learned over the years about filmmaking. And also it was making me reflect on some of the things that I'd heard within education that I completely disagree with. And actually, if Del Toro had an alternate career in which he'd worked in filmmaking but then hadn't had the success that he had, but then went into education, his views might be shot down by other lecturers. And it was just kind of interesting to reflect on that here we are 1 year later, and yet some of the things that Del Toro's saying completely clash with the way filmmaking is presented within education. I did watch the Kronos 4K on the Friday night, and I'm going to bring in some of the points that he makes on that disc as we go through some of the points Guillermo del Toro made during his Q&As and introductions. So we drove down on the Saturday, and the Crimson Peak screening was up first, Saturday afternoon. And what was amazing when what was it? So someone at the BFI introduced the film first without Guillermo del Toro present, and they said how many people have seen the film, how many people haven't seen the film. And what was interesting was almost 75%, maybe more, of the audience hadn't seen it before, which shows, well, one, it's quite scary for micro-budget filmmakers that here, I'm in a cinema and 75% of the audience haven't seen a film by Guillermo del Toro. Like, what chance do I have? Secondly, it shows that people will maybe engage with screenings if someone's there to help to discuss it and help them understand it in some way. So that was kind of interesting. And what I decided to do, rather than film all of the events, is I recorded all the Q&As and introductions in my voice notes app. And what I'm going to do today is just discuss some of the points, not all of them, but some of the points Del Toro made. And I'm going to, rather than do it by screening, so Crimson Peak, Shape of Water, Tales of Arcadia, Pan's Labyrinth, I'm going to group the points into topics rather than how he discussed them at the screenings. So this is what kind of happened down in London. So first up, one of the things that he frequently returns to is this idea of personal filmmaking, and I've played that clip from a lecture. So that gives you an idea of the ways in which Del Toro is drawing on himself for his storytelling. In one of the clips we're going to hear in a minute, he discusses the characters, all the characters being fragments of himself. He only writes characters that he knows. And what's interesting is there was this really revealing moment, and he's talked about this a few times on the Kronos DVD, or DVD 4K. He said, most of us are broken when we're less than 7, and we spend the rest of our lives trying to heal that trauma, but the cracks are always there, and the cracks guide the way you behave. And this resonated so much with me as someone, as a filmmaker who has consistently attempted to present trauma through cinema and find ways of healing. And I think what was interesting about, like, when I released something like Blurred Lines is that people were struggling to see why Martine is behaving the way that she's behaving, and yet we have this scene where we see she's witnessing this trauma as a child of her parents fighting, and she struggles to deal with conflict. And so we keep seeing her playing over conversations and mistakes and overthinking how she's behaved during moments of conflict, and she struggles to challenge this guy in her life who is a male like her father, and she struggles to stand up to him in the way that she'd like. So it's interesting that Del Toro talks about cinema in that way, that it's these traumas from childhood that then characters are trying to work out, and that's presented in his films. And he talks about on Kronos, his first film was based on his great aunt, who he refers to as like his grandmother because she raised him. The first film is dedicated to her, but it was based on the fact that he could see that she was in some ways imperfect, in some ways she was cruel, but he understood that he loved her. And one of the themes that he wanted to explore in this film about a vampire, like, let's not always remember there's a fantasy element, or often a fantasy element. Then the story being, could a child see their grandparent as monstrous but still love them? So there is this element of the monster, like an autobiographical element in there, and the humans are obviously are often the monstrous character. I've talked about the Hellboy ending, where he put something that he'd said to his first wife in the mouth of Hellboy and had Hellboy say that line of dialogue. So he's always presenting himself in presenting his characters, personal characters, and he's also presenting autobiography. I saw an article for Frankenstein that discussed the changes from the book, and it was discussing this character that Christoph Waltz plays. And it said, obviously, this character isn't in the book, but it's a character that gives the funds, the money to Victor Frankenstein to do his experiments and create the creature. And this article was saying perhaps this is representative of some of the studios and these heads of studios that Del Toro has dealt with, whereby we have characters who offer money, but then when we're getting close to completion on a project, suddenly changes the goalposts, and that's what we see with that Christoph Waltz character. And I thought that was quite interesting. And in that Kronos DVD, he talks about how Francois Truffaut said it's interesting to look at a filmmaker's first feature and look whether within the first few feet of their first film, obviously we're not dealing with feet of celluloid anymore, but so let's say minutes, the first few minutes of their first feature, whether you can see the filmmaker that they became throughout their career. And I think you absolutely can with Guillermo del Toro. And one of the things that I was keen to do with the module, the university module that I taught, personal independent filmmaking, was getting students to start thinking about who they want to be as storytellers and what they want to say as storytellers. Because to me, like, training filmmakers to be cover bands, like copying things that they've seen, it's not the way forward. And I think, like Spielberg said it recently, like studios are going to be in a lot of trouble if all they continue to do is present films based on IP. We need original stories, and I think the original is found in the personal. And what's interesting in these clips that you'll hear in a minute is Del Toro talking about all these characters being him, which was disappointing then when I saw some of the students who I taught claiming I was narcissistic for doing something like that, presenting a character that was based on me. And there was this accusation that, oh, everyone is Mark. It's like, well, Del Toro does it. If it's good enough for Del Toro, it's good enough for me. And I think it's a damn shame when people start saying that, oh, the personal is just an ego fest or narcissism. We just wouldn't say that about other art forms. And that's something Del Toro talked about over the weekend, how we seem to look at film in ways that we wouldn't for other art forms. We'd consider all the elements, not just the plot, not just the characters or the structure of the screenplay. So anyway, here's some clips about what Del Toro had to say on personal filmmaking, an autobiography. They're a bit chopped up because they're from the various screenings. Sally, who he refers to, is Sally Hawkins in The Shape of Water. Enjoy.
I think that Sally is almost like the girl from Pan's Labyrinth grown up. And obviously I am the girl from Pan's Labyrinth, and I am Sally, and I am the creature, unfortunately not Michael Shannon.
Are you Edith? How much of yourself do you see?
Well, yeah, I'm Edith, I'm Lucille. Well, yeah, I'm a little bit of Thomas Sharp. Yeah. I'm the dad. Like, I write only characters that I feel I am, or I know very deeply. You know, I can be Victor in a bad day, and I can be the creature. And I think Lucille is very moving, because if you ask her, she's taking care of Thomas all the time. Because possessiveness, which is one of the most terrifying things in life, for me, I try to write that because I experienced it. Not necessarily I am that, but I felt it. To me, the revelations, the way they happen in the movie, and the way she kills her brother, they were the most touching, moving, horrible moments for me. So, you know, I think that you write from what you know, and if you know your defects, you're blessed. If you think you're perfect, you're cursed. Shape of Water, I said, same as Panasonic, I said, damn it, I don't care what anyone thinks, I'm just gonna do this crazy, insane premise, because I need it.
When it comes to story and script writing, he often writes, he's a writer-director. Later on, I think I've got a clip for you where he talks about the fact that he's written 40 plus screenplays, he's only made 12 movies. So this is a guy who's practiced the art of script writing and storytelling a lot for feature films. But one of the things he said in his BFI fellow speech, and there was a clip of this put on Instagram, he discussed the fact that films are not just plot, script and characters. They're the whole. So we've got camera, we've got editing, we've got sound, we've got costume. And I'm going to read a couple of quotes here from the Cabinet of Curiosities book, which sits on my shelf. So it's like an interview type presentation in the book. He says, "I've always written my movies, but I have a real problem with writing them the way they should be written." And the interviewer says, "In what way?" And Del Toro says, "In the way that I read every scriptwriting book. In the way that I read every screenwriting book growing up, but I couldn't help but disagree constantly, because I would always think of how many times Capote or Hemingway or so many of the writers I admire don't follow or portray their characters through any of those devices. A lot of the stuff we leave in as a screenwriter, like the rules of the game, the antagonist's plan, and finally the character's arc, is contradicted by majestic works of fiction that contradict and question those rules." Apologies for stumbling over my words there. I've taken a picture of the book and I'm struggling to see the size of the writing. And I think that's really interesting because it's something that I've often thought about. If these script writing gurus had the answers, they'd be millionaires, right? Because they just keep churning out. I mean, some of them are, but they, instead of running workshops and selling tickets to book tours, they'd be writing the screenplays and making millions, surely. Because maybe, my opinion, when you start seeing those the plot and you can predict what is going to happen, I think that's a problem. When the story is so familiar, you know exactly where this story is going. And then in another section of the book, the interviewer asks about Del Toro's scriptwriting tutor, and I'll get to this scriptwriting tutor in a bit, because he discussed him on the Kronos DVD as well. But he said, "You've mentioned that he, the scriptwriting tutor, used to say, if a road is not presented, you build one." Del Toro: "Yes, he always said that. He would give you rules that you understood immediately. One of the things he used to say was, look, it's bullshit that a character needs to change through the movie. Sometimes the greatest character is the one who doesn't change. Those are characters that whatever they do, they stay the same. It's not like Forrest Gump becomes smarter in the end. Sure, there's a journey, there's a pilgrimage, but there is not necessarily what Hollywood understands as an arc." And he discussed this over the weekend in relation to the Tales of Arcadia series, where he talked about, he wanted, the studio, Netflix, was saying, well, what's the arc of this character, Jim? And he's like, well, no, I just want him to be a good guy. And it's not that he's on this arc. I mean, I guess he is on an arc, but he wanted him to be a good kid, and things happen to him that he has to respond to. Not necessarily that he starts as an angsty kid who then learns to be less angsty and more selfless rather than selfish. He's selfless from the beginning, and then we see what that character has to deal with throughout the series. And as I say, I've not watched it yet. And equally with Pan's Labyrinth, we have a girl who begins the film believing in fairies, believing in the power of storytelling, and ends the film the same way. Yes, she does a few things along the way, like she eats the grapes when she's not meant to, but essentially she's the same character, and all what she has to do is respond to these tasks that this fawn sets for her. But the character is the same, and it's the people around her that keep trying to change her, but she holds true to what she believes in. And again, I think script writing tutors frequently cite formulas, and I think this is why some of the student filmmakers that I dealt with struggled with blurred lines, because they couldn't fathom a character like Martine. There was this element of there is no plot momentum in one of the reviews, but Del Toro has frequently said cinema is not just about plot, it's about other things, it's about the emotional journey. So some people said nothing escalates or evolves. Again, we have a character like Ophelia, where she starts and ends the film the same way, and in many ways she's validated for what she believes in. She's reunited with her mother and father. Another one said the plot ran out of steam. Now, Del Toro, from my understanding, would say, okay, yeah, there's not the mechanical resolution of a story structure, but there's an emotional resolution, and that's something that I'm keen to present. And I've always said this, I think cinema is about, micro-budget cinema is about doing things a little bit differently. If I'm just trying to be a cover band of Hollywood studios, I might as well give up, right? And maybe some people say, yeah, you should give up, Mark. But no, I'm too old and too far down the line for doing that. Yeah, and it's like when I read the review on Martine's Little Miss Perfect, which in my film I just completely disagree with, because she admits to her faults frequently, and that's why we see this character replaying her problems over and over and over. She's flawed. But anyway, one of the things that's interesting to me is that Del Toro on the Kronos DVD said logic should not exist on film. It should be a case of, does this make sense within the context of the film? So little things like at the end of Kronos we see the vampire. He's, spoilers, I mean it's from 1993, but spoilers, skip ahead if you don't want to hear the ending. But the vampire chooses death, and then we skip, and this happens at kind of this factory, but then we kind of leap within one scene of to the very next scene. He's shown back in his bed at home, surrounded by his granddaughter and his wife, and it's not a case of, oh, how did they get there? He then says about Hitchcock referred to those as, that question, as sandwich conversations for later. So you're making a sandwich and then you go, wait a minute, how did they get there? But within the film, it's not a case of, oh, you need to show that logic of how we got from here to here. It's about presenting it within the context of the film of, does this feel emotionally resonant? And within his storytelling, what's really interesting is he frequently talks about what he likes, and he talks about melodrama. And in terms of melodrama, obviously sometimes get a bit of a bad rap, but on the Kronos DVD, and he talks about this again at one of the Q&As, he says melodrama tackles smaller things, so devices by which characters destroy each other via human impulses, whereas drama is led by grander concerns, so it could be war, destiny, the gods. And obviously Del Toro does do a little bit of drama and melodrama because he works within genre. But he's keen to point out that melodrama is about tackling the smaller things in life, the human impulses and the human emotions, and that's something that really resonates with me. And I think like maybe this is why my films don't find the audience that they should have, because they're not concerned with those larger dramatic questions. They're concerned with the smaller human elements, the emotional internal struggle, the internal conflict. But one of the things that I found really interesting is that he said one of the things that he's learned over his 40 scripts is that you should never be ahead of the story. As an audience, you shouldn't know where this is going to go. And one of the things when I watched X and Blurred Lines recently is that I love the fact that when the film starts, you don't know where this is going to go. And it throws curveballs your way where suddenly it goes off in a different direction to the way you'd usually see this story. And I think this is super important, that you shouldn't be ahead of the story as an audience. I remember marking a film once so when I was working at a university, we used to mark like the dissertation films with other staff essentially. So there might be 5 or 6 of you in the room, and there was this one film about it was about a child or something, but like something Del Toro might do actually, but not like this. And I don't know, maybe 2 minutes into it, I knew exactly where this film was going to go. I could have walked out the room, walked back in 15 minutes later and said, so did such and such and such a thing happen? And everyone would have gone, yes. I think that's a problem in storytelling. But what was interesting was, I mentioned this in the marking session and I was told, well, I don't think that matters. I don't think that's a problem. And it's like, it is a problem. Why am I watching something? Like, my time is precious. Our time on this planet is precious. Del Toro talks about this, that the thing that makes our life meaningful is the fact that we face death. And that might sound a bit morose for a podcast, but that idea of time is something I frequently return to. And if we've got a film whereby for 15 minutes I have to watch it play out exactly in the way that I know it will play out, I think that's a problem. But I was told it wasn't a problem. And then here I am sat in front of Guillermo del Toro as he talks about storytelling, and he says, it is a problem. So it's like, okay. And it's not that I'm trying to compare myself to Del Toro. Like, he is one of the masters, and it's like when I talked about Scorsese previously. micro-budget filmmakers can never be in the league of these filmmakers who are at the top of their game. But we're doing it for other reasons. We're doing it for personal expression. If I was a painter with a little workshop, a shed at the end of the backyard, I wouldn't be competing with, I don't know, Edward Hopper or Van Gogh. I just wouldn't. But I'm doing it for my own means, for personal expression, to be creative. That is why we do it. So it was interesting. What was really interesting was, on the way out, we were walking back to the tube at Waterloo from the BFI, and I was trying to remember everything he'd said. And Miranda reminded me of what Del Toro had said about you should never be ahead of the story. And I was like, yeah! And then I was like getting all like heightened and passionate about discussing not knowing where stories are going to go. And we were about to cross the road to walk to the train station. I looked to the side and I stopped talking immediately, because I realised that the person stood next to me while I was ranting was Mark Commode, the film critic. So then we were walking and I was like quiet, and then I nodded to Miranda and I went, that's Mark Commode. So yeah, I was like getting all heightened, and then Mark Commode was stood by the side of me walking towards the train station with, I think it was his partner, who lectures in film. Anyway, that's a bit of an aside, bit of a tangent. So yeah, you shouldn't be ahead of the story. So anyway, let's have a listen to what Del Toro says about story and script writing and plot, and why it's not always about plot.
The thing that I went and they said, what is the arc of the main character? What does he like? I said, he's a good boy. And they said, what do you mean? I said, I don't want him to have this fake adolescent angst. I want things to go wrong for him. And that's more real. And to try to take the audience through an emotional journey with purely filmic environments. We discuss movies in terms of plot and character, and we should be discussing movies in terms of the plasticity of its elements. We do that with other arts. The real content of the movie is the camera moving, the colors, how it makes you feel. I think of Creature from the Black Lagoon, not exactly a masterful screenplay, but the creature swimming underneath Julie Adams is a piece of poetry. So I try to do that. I don't think the movie is just the screenplay and the characters. The movie is the experience of going through the movie. And I love Mexican melodrama. It's so crazy. If you need to classify tragedy, it's the gods or larger forces that can be controlled going against the protagonist. Drama is forces that are larger than individuals that oppose the quest of the main character. Melodrama is purely from equivocal sources. Things that are not communicated or not acted upon and are tragically blind. So, melodrama is a thing that you could, in real life, solve with one conversation. And it's so tenuous. I have said this in the past, forgive me if I repeat myself, I've written at least 40 screenplays. I've done 13 movies. So 27 times I've written a full screenplay. And most of the time they don't materialize. So over 20-something movies I've written. Give or take, each movie takes about minimum 8 months to write. So you're talking about 12 years or more of a 30-year-old career have gone to the void. But I never, ever give up. Pinocchio took so long. Frankenstein was in development for more than 20 years. So, I think that it's not important. You learn from everything. I am a writer, director, producer. If I don't produce, I direct. If I don't direct and I don't produce, I write. So I am a craftsman. Anyway, I'm learning my craft as a writer. I'm solving problems. Writing is inspiration and engineering, both. I'm learning a lot about the craft of engineering the story. For example, cracking the structure of this movie was so difficult, because I have to give it to you so you follow. You should never lead on the story. You should always not know what's going to happen next, but I should know. So, I don't think any of that learning, when you learn a craft in the past or in the East, in Japan, you have to be an apprentice for 15 years. And that makes you a more nimble storyteller. But you have to say, I don't know this. Can I learn it? And it's really interesting to learn new stuff.
Now, one of the things that was interesting when we were, I mean, this is going to be a short segment now, but one of the things that was interesting to me when hearing Del Toro talk about Tales of Arcadia was the fact that story was something that he thought of in different terms. And to me, film and TV are not the same. Now, when I remember working at a university once, and when I started, I was discussing like streaming and all these different ways of storytelling that are happening, and another lecturer said, well, it's all the same now. And I remember thinking, not to me it isn't. Like, a film is very different, or should be very different, to a television series. And why? Because they've got different demands. So a film is something that's a story that's presented, or an idea that's presented through, 2 hours, whereas a TV show is presented, maybe over 8 hours or 10 hours or several series. So they're not the same. They're fundamentally not the same. And one of the things that used to drive me a little bit crazy is I used to work with someone who had a background in TV, and they frequently spoke about editing in ways that were influenced by their background in TV. But that's not the same as discussing story in terms of a short film. It just isn't. And Del Toro discussed the fact that he used specific storytelling devices for his television show, and he called it Velcro. I should have asked really what the difference between Velcro is and a cliffhanger, but I don't think he was meaning it in terms of you leave a cliffhanger, but you leave something for the audience to question, that then they want to look at the next one and go, okay, what next? And here he is talking about that.
And now one of the techniques we use in episodic TV, and now I can say like I'm a whole season pro, but I have now created a couple of series. We end up every episode with what I call Velcro, meaning something ends where you go, next episode, you know that late night at midnight when you should be asleep because you're working tomorrow, and let's watch one more. That's Velcro.
Now, one of the things Del Toro frequently talks about, and I remember this on the Pan's Labyrinth DVD, he talked about some of the on-screen natural wipes. So, like, in Star Wars you might have screen wipes where between one scene and the next scene there might be an iris, or we swipe from left to right. And he took that from Kurosawa, but Del Toro started doing it in Pan's Labyrinth. These on-screen wipes where we'd go behind a tree, for instance, and then we'd cut to another scene taking place elsewhere using a tree. Bit difficult to explain on a podcast without a clip to go with it. And I remember he mentioned on the Pan's Labyrinth DVD where he talked about this being eye protein. So not eye candy, eye protein. And he returned to this frequently over the weekend, because what he said it was about was, you don't present a story just because this is cool, or we're going to do this camera shot because this is cool. He wants to know what it serves in terms of the story. And in Pan's Labyrinth, we have these moments where Ophelia, the little girl, is walking deeper into the forest, and we use these natural wipes, these screen wipes, to cut to the civil war that's going on in Spain, where we see the horses charging. He uses these screen wipes to start entwining the stories, and then we're making those connections that perhaps Ophelia's notions of living in a fairy tale, maybe she's descending into this world of fantasy and escapism to escape the horrors that surround her. And obviously it all comes together in the end as well, but it was interesting that frequently he discussed the elements of storytelling, cinematography, costume, editing, in terms of what does this do for the story. He said, don't come to me with a beautiful idea, come to me with story elements. And this was interesting because different filmmaker, but I was recently watching the Criterion edition of Kiarostami's film The Wind Will Carry Us. And it was about this documentary filmmaker who goes out to this village because he wants to film an event that happens. I don't want to spoil it. Film an event that happens when people die within this community. And on the brilliant film, by the way, and in terms of plot momentum and things like that, like this would probably bore the hell out of some student filmmakers, but I found it so moving, and incidentally contained one of the most violent or cruel things that I've seen in a film in quite some time. And Miranda was half watching it with me, and she said, "What the hell is this snuff movie that you're watching?" And I started laughing because it was like quite a slow-paced film for much of the runtime, but then suddenly this character did something that was so cruel. And it's that idea of, well, I won't spoil it, but Del Toro talked about it. We are everything. We are the bastard son. We are the good son. We're the bastard dad. We're the good dad. Like, all colours of the rainbow should exist within us. But what was interesting on the DVD was, I say DVD, Blu-ray, Kiarostami talked about this sort of travelling shot, this tracking shot where we see this documentary filmmaker walking with a young child through the woods. And he said early on in the shoot, the crew were getting frustrated with the way he was wanting to make films. And he says at the end of this interview that a camera, 2 or 3 lenses and a tripod is enough for him. And obviously this crew showed up thinking they were going to get out all the lights, all the gear, but it wasn't for him. And he said he eventually did this travelling shot where the characters, we track alongside them as they walk through this forest. He did that shot because he wanted to keep the crew motivated, but he said he looks at it now and it brings him nothing but pain. He said later on when the camera not locks off because it's handheld, but when the camera holds and we see the trees in relation to the 2 characters, we realise that the trees are firmly rooted in the ground. And the issue for Kiarostami was, in this travelling shot, he said it's suddenly the trees have got up and gone on a walk. We see them walking in the opposite direction of the 2 characters. Now, they're not literally walking, but I understood what he was getting at. So whereas, and this is where like storytelling and filmmaking is all individual taste, because I previously just moments ago spoke about how Del Toro used the walking tree to swipe between different scenes. But we're in a fantasy, right? Whereas for Kiarostami, he's presenting this very small, human, intimate, real story. For him, he didn't want that. But when he explained it, how he talked about it, that he doesn't want the trees walking. He doesn't want that sort of fantastical image. He wants them to be rooted in the ground, something that has existed for generations, where these 2 characters we're following, they're going to be fleeting in the grand scheme of things, aren't they? And these trees are much older than we are. And one of the beautiful images at the end of that film, we see this stick floating down a stream, and it's like nature will go on, and our time will just be the stick that's floating through the stream. But hearing Kiarostami talk about how he thinks about filmmaking, I realised there's a filmmaker who's totally in control of what they're doing, and they understand when something isn't right for the story that they're telling. And the same applies to Guillermo del Toro. That's a filmmaker who's so in control of what he's doing and why. I remember marking another film, and it really did split the whole staff in 2, because there was some that thought this film was brilliant, and there was other staff, like maybe a bit less than half the room. Most of the room really liked the film. The other half didn't like it at all, and it was for a number of reasons. But I remember one of the issues was that they had lapel mics on the actors, and you could hear, like, every time the actors moved, it was rustling their clothing. I thought, oh, that's not good, because you're marking things for when you're assessing student films, you're looking at things like the creative elements, which is the story and how they present that story, and then the technical elements, which are things that are a little more black and white as far as I'm concerned. If you can hear the microphones being rubbed, or shots that are out of focus, or you can't hear the actors, what they're saying, that's a technical issue. And a large number of the room wanted to go really high on this film. I remember one tutor said, "This is really sophisticated," and I thought, I don't see this sophistication, and it's that they're entitled to their opinion. But I remember it got quite heated. I didn't think I was being heated. Maybe I underestimate how I speak about things, but a lot of the room were kind of arguing for this film. But I thought I didn't see the control that they were discussing or that they were seeing in this film. And it goes back to what Del Toro and Kiarostami are talking about, that they can articulate why they're doing things. I didn't get the sense that this filmmaker knew why they were doing things, and it was a film that was shot on a phone, which I have no issue with. But then there were shots where like a character would just be like completely like half chopped in the frame, half not, and it was like a shot that was locked off. And I thought, why have they done that? I don't know why they've done that, and I don't think they know. And the fact that the microphones are being rustled frequently tells me that I don't think this filmmaker's in control of what they're doing. Anyway, another filmmaker was like, well, I'd give it an award at my festival. And it's like, well, what does that really mean? Yeah, that doesn't invalidate another assessor's views of this film. Because as we've said previously about festivals, it's kind of like, so what? If like you go at it long enough, you throw enough money at a festival, you'll win an award. But for me, like I remember another tutor said, "Oh, you think it's out of control?" I thought, no, I don't think the film's out of control, because that would imply something else entirely to me, like rapid editing, rapid cuts, heightened performances, uncontrolled in a way that you're trying to say something to the audience about the world we're living in. No, I mean they're not in control of the elements. And I think what's interesting about Del Toro when he talks about eye protein is that every element is not about, oh, we're going to do a drone shot and then we're going to grab the drone when it lands and then we're going to take it into a tracking shot and then we're going to follow this character. Like, because I've seen student filmmakers who literally reverse engineer their story because they want to do specific, what Del Toro would call cool things. He's not about that. It's not cool for the sake of cool. It's how does this serve the story? Let's have a listen.
What it is in designing, I am not aiming to create something cool. That should not be the drive, or something, or it needs to be a piece of storytelling. I always say, never present me with ideas, present me with story elements. So it's a piece of storytelling. In other words, what I say is, we do not make eye candy, we make eye protein. Don't come to me with any beautiful ideas. Come to me with story ideas. It's something that comes from mise en scène, the internal montage of a shot. It should not be done for beauty, it should be for narrative purpose. I always say, not eye candy, eye protein. You're getting the story.
So, here's what's really interesting about Del Toro for me is the themes within his films. And I think even though he's dealing with sometimes pure fantasy, the themes are the things that he's interested in, that he's wanting to present. What's so interesting is that's what he spoke about most of the time during these Q&As or introductions, was the themes of the stories that he was presenting. He wasn't talking about just the plot or just the characters or just the story structure. And on the Kronos DVD, there's a BFI conversation that's been filmed, and it's on the disc. And he talks about the fact that his first 9 movies before Shape of Water had a sense of loss, a sense of sadness, a sense of nostalgia, which is clearly linked to this idea of the trauma for a child occurring before the age of 7, and then the rest of your life you're trying to put that trauma right. And I think maybe if I was thinking about what it is that I like about Del Toro, it's that it probably is that, because he said The Shape of Water was the first movie that was hungry for life and was life affirming, whereas for me, like, Pan's Labyrinth is the one, but that film's quite tragic. It's really dark and really quite sad. We have a character, and it could almost be called Guillermo del Toro's Do the Right Thing, because we have a character who in the end doesn't obey, doesn't do what they're told to do. They do what they think is morally right. And this is a theme, or a set of themes that Del Toro continually talked about. So he talked about the importance of choice, that his characters make choices. he talked about curiosity, the importance of curiosity. And one thing that I found really interesting is he said certainty is the worst thing for a young mind. He said disobedience is important, it's a virtue, because if we think of Pan's Labyrinth, which I was moved to tears by, there's a character who doesn't do what they're told to do. There's a evening meal organised. She goes out because the faun has asked her to do this task. She disobeys her mother. But then later, when the captain, her stepfather, approaches her and tells her, you do this, you do that, even when faced with death, she doesn't do it. Even when the faun presents her with an option which would be devastating to her little brother, she doesn't do it. She follows her own set of morals. And so disobedience, he says, is a virtue. And what's interesting is he said with Shape of Water, the guys in the suits, the people that were often shown to be the heroes, they're the bad guys. The people who blindly follow orders, that blindly follow the government, for instance. So we see that in Shape of Water. We see that in Pan's Labyrinth. These people who are doing absolute horrific things because they're just following the system. They're obeying. The good people are the ones who disobey, who question, that make choices that might be detrimental to themselves. And he talked about this later, the idea of resistance as a theme, that sometimes you have to resist by being yourself, and it might only help a little bit, but long term you might see the benefits of that resistance. And this idea of obeying and the system being what's monstrous, in recent years I couldn't agree more. Like some of the things that I've seen over recent years, you see people doing things that if this was to be national news, would they be happy with this behaviour? Would they stand by the way they behaved? Would they be okay to say, yes, I believe this is the right thing? So I think the themes that he's talking about and why he presents his films in the way that he does, I think it's something that really resonates with me. And I think what's interesting about Del Toro is that it's that these are not just fantasy films. They're films with deeper themes, deeper ideas that get to the root of what it is to be human or how to live a good life. Okay, have a listen.
Every time I take a movie, I do the opposite. I wanted the movie to have the creature carrying the girl into the water not as a horror image, but as an image of beauty, salvation, and love. And the straight guy with the cool suits and the tight tie that looks like a hero to be a monster, to make the guy, the guy that normally fights the creature, that is a scientist or a government guy, that's the bad guy, and the opposite side of that. So they are fables. I think choice to me, I'm a lapsed Catholic, but I'm raised as a Catholic, and to me the difference, the soul, what makes us human is choice, and that's what we have. It's on Hellboy, if you remember, and in many of my movies, Pan's Labyrinth is all about choice and disobedience. Because the main thing about the film is that disobedience is a virtue, and obedience is not a virtue. I think it kills the soul. I think choice is a virtue, and disobedience is a virtue. It's a question the doctor says, people that obey just to obey are people like you, Captain. The thing that scares me the most in the world is certainty. And the people that are in charge that use the word fair or unfair. Feeling is seen as weakness right now, And skepticism looks like intelligence. When you can be wrong, and we can still have a conversation. Because I think the worst thing you can give a young mind is certainty. I mean, certainty is terrifying. When people look at the worst people on our world have no doubts of what they're doing. And the most intelligent people in our world are constantly in doubt. Yeah, I think that one of the things that I wanted to say is don't think, become. Just become what you want. Act like it already happened. You make them happen somewhere. These choices you make. And if you don't realize that and you just say I'm a victim of circumstance, it's like being in a car crossing arms and not touching the wheel. I don't see the world as evil and good, except when intention takes place, meaning when you know you're doing something terrible and you do it for exclusively terrible means, then yeah, I can argue that's evil.
So yeah, this idea of disobedience, curiosity versus certainty is really interesting. And also what I think in terms of education is interesting, that I find now that students want the hack. I discussed this the other week with Johnny, but there is no hack. Something that Del Toro says on the Kronos DVD, which is really interesting. He says, the older you get, you realise that success as a filmmaker is coming home each day and saying the footage came out as you imagined. So it's not that the success is the Oscar or the success is that your film makes a load of money, but it's that you get home at the end of a shoot day and your footage is close to what you thought of in your head. And the older I get, like, I feel like I'm getting there. And this idea of certainty, I think, just to touch a little further on it, I thought it was so interesting that he talked about it's the worst thing for a young mind, because from my experience in education, I found that courses want to present art as something that is certain by selling formulas, by saying that use action verbs for directing actors. Filmmaking isn't certain. There's nothing certain about it. It involves difficulties. It involves unforeseen issues. Okay, have a listen.
This movie is the second worst filmmaking experience I've ever had. The worst was Mimic, working for the Weinsteins. This was the second worst. It was extremely difficult to do. Everybody said no. They said, you cannot have violence, you cannot kill the girl. I said, the girl doesn't die. Everything that could go wrong went wrong. We scouted the forest, and it was the driest summer in recorded history. Everything was really difficult. And on top of that, the crew thought I was insane. And in fact, a producer from Spain took me to dinner and said, you shouldn't cast Maribel and you shouldn't cast Sergi. And he said, very pointedly, you don't know these things because you're Mexican.
Wow,
And
that's
I said, well, maybe because of that, I don't give a fuck and I'm going to do it. I just did. And you like when I say I don't give a fuck. The movie talks to you about what it needs. And sometimes it does it by vicissitudes, by things that go wrong, by things that are not supposedly blessings. But every single thing that goes wrong is going right. One example that is very fresh in everybody's mind is 9 weeks before we started shooting Frankenstein, the actor that we had cast as the creature got out of the movie. And then we had 9 weeks to find somebody, reproduce the makeup that we had done over 9 months, and start over or stop the movie. And I said, we're going to find somebody perfect. And we found Jacob Elordi.
Obviously, budget. I spoke about the numbers that Del Toro is playing with at the top of this episode. And when we talk about this idea of certainty, that it's the worst thing, like film studios want certainty. Del Toro knows that there is no certainty, or that it's not that it's okay to be uncertain. And studios want certainty through things like test screenings, through star names. They want a clear sense that we're going to recoup our costs. And one of the things he spoke about on the Kronos 4K was that for years he wanted to make this film on 35mm. And people said to him, well, what if you never get to do this? And he said, well, if I don't get to do it, it doesn't get made. And he backtracked on that. He said eventually he came to understand that I have to make this film. If it has to be on Super 8, it'll be on Super 8. And he's like, what am I going to do? Not do it. And he said it took him years to get the film made because studios want certainty. Things like when you think about The Shape of Water, okay, we'll give you 3.5 million more or whatever it was if you do it in colour, because obviously colour for them is more certain than audiences showing up for a black and white movie. But what's interesting is, in the end, what got him the budget or what got him on the road to directing feature films was who he knew and having a good attitude to work. So he said for years he was doing makeup effects on various Mexican projects, TV, film, and there was this producer who saw that he was working really hard. I think he said something like over 100. He was doing the makeup for over 100 people per day, and this person recognised that he had a good attitude to work. And that was when this producer said, "Can I have a look at your script?" And he said this was after, I think he said he wrote it at some point in the 80s, and then finally, early 90s, it starts to get a little bit of traction, and then he's on his way to becoming the Guillermo del Toro that we know. But I think that's so important, this idea of having a good attitude to work, and we'll get to that later because he discussed collaborators in detail. Have a listen.
I'm fiscally very aware. Frankenstein was done at ended at $600,000 under budget. Pacific Rim $4 million under budget. Money is lack or freedom. They either take you more money, less freedom. What we do is a marriage of budget and creativity. I think it's good to have a constraint. The budget makes you know what is important. That one thing, you can never have everything. And if you think the budget is the obstacle, the budget is actually the solution.
Del Toro talked about the fact that studios will want to do test screenings, and he's like, I don't care what audiences think. Like, I've made this film, I've made it for me. And like, I remember there was a lecturer who was encouraging students to do test screenings for short films. And I remember thinking, that is just so bizarre to me. Like, if you can't get the story for a short film right, why are you doing test screenings? And these students were saying, well, we'll make changes. And I was like, okay, are the actors going to come back for these reshoots if the audience doesn't like your film? Who are you asking? What makes you think that they're the right people to be asking? How is it going to impact continuity if you come back weeks later after editing a full short film and then actors look completely different? How's that going to work? And it's interesting to hear someone like Del Toro say, I don't want to do test screenings. Famously, Martin Scorsese, the test screenings for Goodfellas were shocking. The audiences didn't like it. Like, it matters who you ask, and you have to stand true to what you think is right for the film. That's why you're the filmmaker. It's like, if we go back to the car analogy, you wouldn't just go on the street and ask 100 random people what they think of the engine of a car. Like, they might have an opinion, but is it an informed opinion? Do they know why they're saying these things? But Del Toro does screen the film for close filmmakers, and he discusses the importance of brutal feedback. So he doesn't want to test screen for random audiences, but he will screen the film to filmmakers for brutal feedback. And what's interesting is he's someone who's accepted this for a long time. On the Kronos 4K, he talked about his scriptwriting tutor ripped up an early attempt that he made of the Devil's Backbone script. And if you ask Del Toro now, he'd say, yeah, that was completely the right thing to do. It might have hurt at the time, but he needed that in some way. And he said that the film that he ended up making when he did do Devil's Backbone had a whole other element that was brought into the film, this idea of the film opening with an unexploded bomb, World War or Spanish Civil War. Anyway, there's a bomb and it doesn't go off, but it lands in the courtyard of a children's home, an orphanage. That element came years later. It wasn't in that first version of Devil's Backbone. Now, Del Toro could have said to the tutor, you're fucking wrong, and I guess that might have been his first reaction, but actually in the long term it served him well that the teacher was so honest with him. So this idea of having brutal feedback from other filmmakers, he says it's not to hurt each other's feelings, but sometimes those difficult conversations around film have to happen. What I found interesting having taught for quite a long time, is how that has changed. I've never ripped up anyone's script, but it's become more difficult to be honest with student filmmakers about their work. And I've discussed this previously because obviously we know that feedback that I gave led to what happened with the Blurred Lines reviews. But what's interesting is I've now worked with people who say, so say they students show a rough cut of their film. Now, a rough cut should be not an assembly cut, not the first cut. It should be starting to really take shape and getting to what a rough cut should be getting towards what this film might eventually become. But I've seen tutors say, instead of saying, okay, this worked, this doesn't work, I think you need to go away and work on this, there's now this way of saying, what would you like feedback on? Now, if you present that question to anyone, they probably will go towards the things that they like, right? They're going to go, oh, well, could you talk about this shot or this edit? If you said to Del Toro, if I say to Del Toro, not that I would ever be in the room of filmmakers he'd be getting feedback on, what would you like feedback on? It'd be very easy for him to say, oh, well, could you talk about the eye protein, the cinematography or the costume design, the set design, the production design? What he might need to hear is the scene that's not working. And he spoke about how there was a 9-minute sequence in Frankenstein. So this has been his dream project for decades. He had this long sequence and he said it was beautiful. But this filmmaker, I think it might have been James Cameron, said it's got to go. As great as it is, it's got to go. And he cut it. And he said it's not always a case of you do all of the suggestions, you make the changes, but you have to hear it. He talked about Alfonso Cuarón talking about a shot in Frankenstein that he didn't like, but Del Toro took it out and then thought about it and then put it back in. So it's not that you have to make those changes, but he says you've got to listen to them. Equally, Del Toro's someone who is willing to admit when he's made cuts that don't work. So there's an element in Pan's Labyrinth where I discussed previously, Ophelia eats these grapes off this table and she's not meant to eat them. He said initially that in the cut there was this line where one of the servants said to Ophelia, you've not eaten all day, come on, let's get you something to eat. And that kind of sets up why she might disobey the fawn and eat from the table that she's not meant to eat at. So he's someone who is constantly questioning, why is this going in? Why is it coming out? Is this right for the film? Even sometimes reflecting after the fact that, okay, maybe that wasn't right for the film. But this culture of what would you like feedback on is not good as far as I'm concerned. And it's this kind of reassurance culture, but that's not how the world works, is it? Because if you have a dissertation student, they're 6 months away from working, getting paid for their work. No one's going to say, if you're, I don't know, say you're doing corporate videos or an advert for a company, Nike are not going to say to the filmmaker, well, what would you like feedback on? They're going to tell you what they think works or doesn't work. So clarity is kindness. And Del Toro constantly spoke over the weekend about there should be room for adult conflict. He said increasingly we're seeing that there isn't, and part of that he attributes to what's happening online. For me, what was really shocking, like I spoke previously about this difficulty I found myself having with getting to a place where students were so adverse to feedback that I found myself unable to speak. It was really causing me I had a panic attack because what I wanted to say about a project I was unable to say. And after being signed off sick and coming back to education, I made a conscious decision to try and be honest about where things didn't work. And hearing Del Toro talk about the importance of this feedback from filmmakers, it reminded me that, okay, it's obviously not gone well for me, like the backlash to Blurred Lines and the fact that then I'm no longer in that post is not great. But when Del Toro said resistance is important, honesty, like disobedience, and that's not saying like I was disobeying the job, but this culture of what would you like feedback on, pushing back on that a little and saying, no, okay, my experience as a filmmaker means that I should be honest and tell these people what I think works and what I think doesn't work, because Del Toro said, he said to a friend recently, you're going to hear it from me because you're either going to hear it from an audience or you're going to hear it from a critic. So it's better to hear it from me now. And I think that's what the importance of a rough cut screening should be, right? That someone's there who can say these things before these films go out into the world. And what's interesting with the Blurred Lines backlash that I experienced is many of these films that these students took umbrage with because I gave them feedback are nowhere to be seen. Like, if these students are so sure that their film was right, then let the world decide. But I think their reaction is understandable given the society that we're now living in which people are increasingly unable to accept feedback, honest feedback. And hearing Del Toro remind me of the importance of brutal feedback was reassuring in some ways. Anyway, here he is talking about some of those things, feedback and test screenings.
I once hate the movie, but I once had a conversation about a movie that went very well at the end, and they said, well, why do you want to do a lot of testing? And I said, I don't want to test. And they said, well, how will you know what the audience finds about the movie? I said, I don't care about what they think about the movie. And he said, well, it's a pretty big movie for that. And I said, well, that's where you fucked up. You know? I shared with like 15, 16 directors that are very close to me. And they all have the sworn, the sort of a Hippocratic oath to be brutal with each other. And we absolutely...
To make it the best it possibly can.
Well, you say, look, like I said the other day to one of these friends, I said, either you're going to hear it from me, or you're going to hear it from the audience, or you're going to hear it from the critics. But this is what is wrong. And it's not that it's good or bad, and then whether you do it or not, because sometimes what you think is the defect is the virtue, but you have to be challenged. And if you say no, like Alfonso didn't like the shot of me and Golf walking down the stairs with the candelabra. And I took it out for 5 minutes. And I said, it goes back in, you know, because it's the essence of the film in many ways. And so we don't have to listen to each other, but we have to listen.
So then, following my feedback, my honest feedback, students then decided they were going to be brutally honest with myself. And one of the things that they attacked in Blurred Lines was what they perceived as an unprofessional or unacceptable approach to working with collaborators. And what was interesting with Del Toro was that he sounded like Martin. Now, I'm not comparing myself to Guillermo del Toro, but he says he will only work with people who are willing to die for their craft. And I'll play this clip in a minute. And it's a little bit muffled, but that's what he's saying in one of the clips. He says he wants to work with people who will die for the craft because he would. And he said he would be happy to die on a set. He says that he expects 100% from collaborators. Now, Martine was a character in my film that was realising that she was dealing with people who don't give 100%. And I think maybe I don't know what's going on in society, but increasingly I've seen people who don't want to give 100% to art. Now, if you're working in the bank, or you're working, no offence to bankers, or you're working in McDonald's, no offence to McDonald's workers, you might start to go through the motions. You might just do the job. But for me, art is something that requires 100% of yourself. That you want to be with people who think that this is important. Werner Herzog calls it foot soldiers of cinema. Now, Notion, I realised when I first tried to make it, I was dealing with people who didn't want to go all the way. Which is why, and Del Toro talks about this in relation to budget. He says when things appear to be going wrong, they're actually going right. And the film, when things seem to be going wrong, is telling you what it needs. What happened with Blurred Lines is exactly that. The actors were not right. The film, I realised, was not going to happen. The world had a way of telling me that let's not do that. We made Blurred Lines. Make of that what you will, that film. We made Notion the next summer. I found people who would give 100%, who I got a sense would die for their craft. Now, listen, I don't want anyone dying on a film, but I understand the sentiment of what Del Toro's going at, that this is, if this proves to be the last thing we do, we can go, yes, we did our best, we gave it everything. Werner Herzog says, I'd go into the pits of hell and wrestle the devil for one of my movies. He says, there's never an excuse not to finish a film. That's always stood with me, that line. There's never an excuse not to finish a film. A filmmaker reached out to me recently because they'd worked on this project and then suddenly they heard that the director and writer are not going to finish it. Now, this is a short film. What's the excuse after everyone's put in their hours? You've had actors who've given their time. Where's the excuse not to finish it? To not go the all in and give it 100%? And to me, it's that Martin has a line in Notion, there's a lot of tourists in this business. I think a lot of people like the idea of creativity, but a lot of people are not willing to give it 100%, which is what I think it requires. And further to that, what was really interesting is that Del Toro is willing to tell someone when the idea isn't needed for the film. The film doesn't need it. So a lot of people were saying, I'll get to it in a minute, but oh, Martine is unreasonable. She should listen to the actors and see what their creative ideas are. Not so. Del Toro's like, I fired people. And I don't know what happened on Frankenstein, but Andrew Garfield dropped out 9 weeks before the shoot. The way he talked about it, I got the impression that this wasn't just a case of conflicting schedules. Something happened there where he had to let someone go. And what was interesting about when he spoke about directing actors, he says you've got to be clear. Like, a direction should not be no longer than 6 words. You should be very specific. Like, I say this, maybe look down on this line. And what's interesting is, over the past few years, I've worked with people who've taught directing, and I actually started to doubt how I would work with actors, being very specific. As Del Toro says, yes, it's a dialogue, but you've got to remember it's also a monologue, i.e., at some point this has got to be filtered through one person. And that's why no matter how many collaborators you have, you can tell a Guillermo del Toro film. They're very specific. When I look through the books I have on my shelf of his films, the design for one film, the drawings are exactly the same for the design for a later film, because it's going through this singular vision. Now, some people don't want to make films like that. Fine. And I think one of the things with Johnny Byram talked about last week, this Mike Lee approach, there's very few people who can do that. But what was interesting to me was with teaching filmmaking within education, I saw students. There was one tutor who was very much, who thought that every film should be a space for actors to just do what they wanted, essentially, which is probably why a lot of students took umbrage with what I was presenting in Blurred Lines. I heard a student say, don't worry, I won't tell the actor what to do, to the directing tutor. I thought, what the fuck does that mean? Like, because I've watched so many DVD extras, I know that that's not the case. I remember watching the Minority Report DVD in something like 2002, and Spielberg was doing a very specific close-up on Tom Cruise, where he wanted Tom Cruise to just move his eyes down, almost down the lens. And on the special features, you see Spielberg say, "Great, that's all I need." And I think Tom Cruise said, "You don't need it." No, he's like, "No, that's all I need." That is okay. And what's been really surprising is that you hear student filmmakers say things like, "Oh, in Blurred Lines, Martine's unreasonable for having an idea of what she wants the film to be." Then you've got people like Del Toro or Spielberg saying, okay, at some point you have to be very specific with actors. All this stuff about Del Toro says, oh, remember, you're now channeling your inner child trauma. He said, no, you're fucked up. He's like, you can be very specific, very clear, and give them the direction. And equally, he said, he will fire people if they don't do the thing that's needed for this project. And it's just really interesting when you think about a film like Blurred Lines. Maybe I've just been too open in presenting that behind-the-scenes conflict. Whereas Del Toro's in a Q&A, the safety of a Q&A, he can discuss these things down the road because he's now Guillermo del Toro, and who's going to argue with Guillermo del Toro? I remember there was a quote in one review for my film that said, real maturity would manifest itself in listening to a range of perspectives. Absolutely. Del Toro would agree that it is important to listen. He talked about that it was important to listen to his filmmaker friends. But there is a caveat. Listening is not the same as obeying. Like, a character like Ricky in Blurred Lines can say all these things about their process, but at some point, I'm not just going to obey. I do have to have my choice. And a filmmaker, the director, is ultimately the person who makes those decisions of, is this right for the film or is this wrong for the film?
I only work with people that would die for their craft, honestly, because I would. If I grew up on a set, I'll die happy. First of all, it's very important that they know that it's a dialogue, but it starts as a monologue. But you know, they have to tell me what they think, and I gotta tell them what they think. But when we start a process, I always say, I don't want to tell you much. Tell me what you think, because it's the only chance you'll have. I joke, but you know, we can have a shorthand. And the hardest thing, you can 50-60% of the people will get you to 70%. About 20% of the people will get you to 80. About 5% of the people will get you to 90. And there's only like 1% of professionals that will get you to the 100%. It's very rare. And I always push for 100%. So the shorthand is very fast. You know, when I was directing Chronos, my first movie, I wrote the part for this Argentinian actor who was my idol. He was like the Laurence Olivier of Latin America for me. And he said, what do you want me to do on this scene? I said, whatever you want is fine because I wrote it for you. And he said, no. Give me a space and I'll be free in there. If you tell me it's unlimited, I'm not free, I'm disoriented. I was directing Kelsey Grammer all of a sudden.
And he is very good in this.
He's incredibly good as Blinky.
And you wrote that part for him?
I wrote that part for him. I wrote most of the Blinky's dialogue. I had to fudge in every episode, almost, at least on the first season, because it had a very precise rhythm, you know. And we were recording this first, and he was too Frasier. He was doing the Kelsey, and I said, you have to bring a bigger quality to it, and a Falstaffian quality. So I said, why don't you do a pirate monster Jim? Yeah. And he did it, and that was when we found Blinky. If you need more than 6 words to correct an actor, you are not directing that person correctly. You have to go in and say quickly, and don't look at her eyes until this line. Good. Perfect piece of direction. Remember, in this scene, you are in the throes of your childhood pain. You fucked up. You are not giving them anything to do. You direct actors by saying, this is what you're going to do or not do. And I think that you have to have clarity and have no ego. Meaning you say, this doesn't work, not because I don't like it, because the movie doesn't need it. So you direct with precision. It's not that the movie dictates itself. Sometimes with you, sometimes against you. Now, the test for a director is to know if there's a problem and you feel that it needs to be solved, then it means it really is a problem, you know?
How do you feel such an environment that people want to continue coming back and working with you, speak so highly of you after, when you might have some conversations of tension or awkward characters that you might need to work with? How do you keep build that good environment? I think it can cross over to all industries.
That's a good question. I think clarity is really, really good. Meaning not everything you do is going to be pleasant. I have fired people. And when you do that, you have to do it directly. I don't do it through anyone else. I sit down and I say, I'm firing you. I'm not being pressured to do it. It's not anyone forcing me, and these are the reasons.
So I think online culture, Del Toro had a lot to say about this. Like he compared it to wrestling. He says like people are taking on these personas that they're not willing to drop, and there's no room for an adult conversation or adult conflict anymore. And as someone who's been subjected to what I would call online abuse, it's quite interesting in listening to Guillermo del Toro and being reminded of a set of values within filmmaking. I remember one of the critics said about Blurred Lines, they call my film imperfect, audacious, and personal. I think it was up top where Del Toro said about the importance of imperfection.
I think the greatest thing is to say, I did it, I'm sorry I did it, how can I make it right? It's a very hard conversation that never happens online. Never. Because online is like wrestling. You put a persona and you hold on to it and you never waver. So there's no real conversations. There's wrestling matches. And that's where communication crumbles. And I think that to me, to be a storyteller, for me, is a huge honor. And it's something that I think is spiritual. I don't think of it as a business. I don't think of it as a virtue, or I think it's something that we need as a tribe. I need Kubrick, I need Fellini, I need Hitchcock, because they guide me.
So I don't know if there's been kind of an overarching idea that I'm trying to present here, and it's not that I'm comparing myself to Del Toro in any way whatsoever, like at all. Like, this guy is a genius, and that's why I'm there in the audience, because one of the things that's really interesting about Del Toro, and I'll play the clips in a moment, he still wants to learn. He's talked about this idea of being curious. He says what he has at the age of 61, he's still curious. He still wants to learn. There's still things that he wants to figure out how to do. And through that, an audience can find that the personal becomes something that's universal. What I found so interesting, that one of the questions for Pan's Labyrinth came from this woman. She must have been 20s, 30s, and she was there with her mum. And she asked about the lullaby that appears throughout Pan's Labyrinth. But she talked about how glad she was to be there with her mum. And like, I turned around, they were on the row behind, and she put her head on her mum's shoulder and she gave her mum a hug. And you realise that through these personal expressions that Del Toro's creating, there's this universal understanding. It reminded me, I remember one of the first times I saw Pan's Labyrinth, I was thinking, oh my God, I was so moved. One, by just the film itself, the story that it presents. But I remember thinking, God, this had so resonate with my own mum. And I remember showing it to her and she was in floods of tears. I don't know whether Del Toro, I mean, he says that his grandma raised him, or his great aunt raised him. I don't know the specifics of what's happened there, but you have someone expressing these childhood experiences and childhood traumas, and someone else can see themselves in that. And I think I first screened it to my mum, maybe on the DVD, and then it was showing one night at the Printworks. They used to do this thing called Flashback Fans. Was it Flashback Fans? I forget. Where they'd show old movies every Monday night. And Pan's Labyrinth was one of them, and I took my mum down. And again, floods of tears. My mum was crying. And it was just beautiful to see this woman on the row behind with her mum, and realising that clearly there was a connection there, a similar connection between parent and child that I had. That comes from being yourself, presenting a personal vision, which is what Del Toro's done. It would have been easy for him at any point to say, well, instead of after Hellboy, I won't do Pan's Labyrinth. I will do a Hollywood blockbuster. Instead, he resisted and fought for what he thought he needed to present, that personal vision. And it's just interesting thinking about seeing Del Toro now in his 60s. And what was quite sad was, at one point he said, I now only want to do bucket list things because I'm in the last fifth of his life. And you think about this idea of time, which has been present in his work. Like, you see the captain in Pan's Labyrinth clinging to this watch that his father had, versus Ophelia, who at the end of her life, there's a flower that springs up, that blooms. A filmmaker is trying to do that in some way. They're fighting against the passage of time, and they're hopefully trying to leave something beautiful when they're gone. And Del Toro, what's crazy is when I met him at 24, I'm now the age, more or less the age he was when I met him, and that time has gone like that.
I think that the first act of resistance is being yourself. So if you are yourself, you're already doing something really, really important. My father was kidnapped. In 1998, he was kidnapped for 72 days. And we had to negotiate the ransom, and we had to find a way to find the money, and we had to do so many things that were all horrible. And the kidnapping negotiator, when he arrived, he said to us, "What do you do? What do you do? What do you do?" I said, "I write." And he said, every morning, for 2 hours, you're going to write. And you're not going to think about the kidnapping, and you're not going to think about your father being in danger. For 2 hours, you are you. And you are not kidnapped. Your father is. And I think I've carried that through my life. Like, the world is terrible, but for 2 hours or 4 hours a day, you can be you, and you can write. And you don't have to give the people that are terrible on top every piece of your soul. You have to keep a piece for yourself. And I think it's very important to tend that garden, because you will, at some point in the day, in the year, in the week, touch somebody by just being yourself. You know, it's very nurturing for all of us to be a bunch of us. You know, when we look around you, there's so many us's here. It's a bunch of us. And each of us is different, and each of us brings something, whether we do it often or not so often. So that's the first type of resistance, I think. Resistance is of consequence. It may not yield results immediately, but the fact that you resist has consequences. It doesn't matter how long you live, but how meaningful it is for someone other than you. Whatever it is, and you are bound to disappoint or wrong a lot of people. That is impossible to avoid, because we are human. Everybody is. And I think that the important thing is how many times you can actually leave a legacy for someone else. I mean, movies have saved my life a few times. A few times I've been so low that I really say, is it all worth it? And you hear a song, or you see a painting, or you watch a movie, or you're in front of a Starry Night by Van Gogh, physically, and you cry, because you see the material brush strokes, and you feel him, and art saves our soul. The thing I have the most of is curiosity. I'm 61 years old, and I'm so curious. I say I'm never, ever bored. You know, everybody has something compelling if you look really carefully. You know, being bored is arrogance. Being curious is humility. Not humility for yourself, but humility for the fact that everything around you is much bigger than you. And the only way we find faith, or the only way we find love for stories, is by surrendering ourselves to a cosmos that should always surprise us. And mind you, this is what I warn against: reducing your world to a digital web experience. Because it seems like the world is reductible, and it isn't. And you don't know anything. And thinking that you do closes you to everything that you don't know, because you don't know. So curiosity is the most vital, salient thing that makes us human, along with choice and disobedience. And curiosity is disobedience.